Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Just to put my title in context, so the Office of Policy is in the Office of the Secretary of Homeland Security, and there's a cargo and transportation section that I'm part of. And so we work a lot with CBP, TSA, anybody within DHS, and the whole of government that touches cargo or transport. All right. Just to give my remarks some sort of high-level context, the Global Supply Chain National Strategy, it was approved by the President about 3 years ago. And this is sort of our overriding guide to what we're doing in the cargo and transport world. And it's a layered risk-based approach. And the emphasis is on sort of just in case. We're trying to promote timely and clearance to facilitate transport into the U.S. and have a system that not only can make that easier, but then also can react to events that happen, but also to have those events not be a major disruption. So if something happens at one point in the supply chain, we don't want to stop everything. So we're trying to make it secure, efficient, and resilient. And I don't know if some of you recall this, but you might. About 4 years ago, we had a scare with a bomb from Yemen, and that shut down the world's post because we just didn't have a system in place that could really account for that. So that was sort of part of our motivation for the international mail strategy. So how does this apply to international mail? All right, so we see this as very much an international project because on the outbound side, we can control that. We work with USPS very carefully. But to make any enhancements to the supply chain for mail work globally, it really we have to work with everybody who's involved. So we work with all the stakeholders of the USPS, who have been a great partner. I'll talk more about their involvement later. We work with a lot of different postal operators around the world and postal groups, mostly ones that are sort of more advanced in terms of what they can do for security. We've worked with the European Union quite a bit, mostly on the customs side, but also we've had talks with their transport people because it's not only, this is customs, but it's also aviation security that I'm talking about. We're also working with national customs authorities, people that share our concern about the mail being vulnerable to potential terrorist attacks. The World Customs Organization, that's come up quite a bit in the last couple of days. They're obviously very key to this in terms of helping to set standards and best practices. UPU, I'll talk about them a bit as well. Of course, they're a big player in the postal world. And IATA and ICAO in terms of the impact on the air carriers. And so we're working with all of these different groups to secure the international postal supply chain. Okay, so what are our guiding principles and goals behind this whole thing? One is to facilitate transport and clearance. And this came up this morning. I thought the gentleman from eBay made a good point that customs should not be seen as obstructionists. I mean, we don't want to hold things. We don't want to look at things that we don't need to. We want to keep legitimate commerce moving. We want to reduce vulnerabilities. So for the mail, we see it as having some gaps. You know, I'll get into those in a bit, but because the UPU has and designated operators have a very unique role because they have to serve the world. They have to accept everything from anybody to go anywhere. So that's very vulnerable. You can't refuse packages. Obtain advanced data and then apply risk management and targeting. Those two go hand in hand, so I'll talk a lot about that. For us to apply the best practices of risk management and targeting to mail, we need the data. So those two are very close. Promote uniform approach to screening and advanced data standards akin to cargo. We're trying to, again, take the best practices of cargo and apply it to mail, but taking differences into account, such as the universal service obligation of post. And we're also looking to achieve customs parity in terms of treatment, the way we treat postal operators versus everybody else, and institute operational response protocols. Again, I refer back to what happened with TSA a number of years ago. We want a system where we know what we're going to do if an event occurs. The international context, some of you may know this, at the last UPU Congress, overwhelmingly, it was approved a resolution that if security authorities required advanced data, postal operators would have to comply. And I was there, and I was quite surprised by how overwhelmingly that passed. I think there were only 4 no votes for that. And I think that was a recognition, some of the comments then were that to really be players, postal operators are going to have to adapt. They're going to have to reflect what the current world is. And this is, again, picking up on some of the themes here, the evolution diagram or whatnot. The UPU isn't what it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It's a different world out there. Letter mail is declining. Packages are really the future. The second thing was to meet these physical security standards. And these are sort of akin to our CTPAT standards. In other words, all postal facilities that process international mail have to have security characteristics that are tight, whether it's access, lighting, that kind of thing. And then any exchange office has to screen mail physically, not only to meet, in our case, TSA, for the EU to meet the DG Move requirements. And so they're kind of linked to ICAO Annex 17 in terms of screening. So you've got to make sure that everything is screened by X-ray. And then the UPU also resolved to help its members meet advanced data requirements. So the second point on this slide is this EDI message standards. Just a bit on this. We've agreed, the UPU and WCO have agreed on global standards for messaging, for pre-advice, okay? And this is the ITMAT, or in CUS item message. And this really just builds on existing EDI exchanges that Post have. Post have been exchanging messages among themselves for many years for accounting and operational reasons. They also exchange messages with air carriers. So we're just building on the existing messages, and so the customs data is a subset of an item attribute message. And so we're trying to enhance those as well to make them what we want in terms of being able to have responses. There was a slide yesterday that mentioned the customs declaration system. The UPU has developed this, which we think is very important because now any country can use that to collect and transmit customs data. You've got about 30 countries or more that have their own systems, but for anybody else, they can use that because a lot of posts, even small countries, have what they call the International Postal System. So the CDS is just an extension of that. So that's a big advancement. And then they also created this supply chain committee, which from a policy perspective and operations looks at these issues in a holistic way. So that was a good change that they made. EU has already published the legislation, and beginning in 2018, they'll be requiring data. That was mentioned this morning in one of the presentations. China, we're not quite clear on their plans, but they also have discussed requiring advanced data on postal items, as we will. So various groups are looking at the remaining issues, and some of them, at least from my perspective, which I think need to be ironed out. The role of the air carriers, I'll talk about that a bit. The scope of items to be pre-advised, what makes sense. We don't want to require data on things that we really don't need data on, but we're just trying to be prudent in our approach. And so all these different groups, you've got WCO involved, UPU, you've got International Post Corporation, we heard from them this morning. The EU has a postal experts group. So, and I just want to make sure that all these people are working on the same model. Okay, our approach is, you may have heard of the Air Cargo Advanced Screening Pilot. So that is basically what we're doing with Cargo and Express, is getting data as early as we can in the supply chain so that we can screen it prior to loading onto aircraft. So we're trying to apply the same thing to mail. But one thing that people sometimes lose sight of is we've been working on advanced data for mail for a while, for customs purposes. So when we began the ACAS pilot, we thought, well, let's just take that a step further for the mail and go back in the supply chain too. So it doesn't, what we're doing for the aviation security does not negate everything we want the data for other purposes, just for customs. Okay, and also we think that the advanced data is going to have some benefits for posts in terms of things like drawback and duty refunds, some of the things that we heard about. So again, and another thing, I mentioned this earlier, we're working to look at the postal versus commercial customs treatment. And we want to sort of align this to the extent that we can, again, taking into the account UPU, obligations on designated operators, and just the fact that it does operate differently. It doesn't operate like an integrated carrier. We're also working with the UPU to propose some ideas to sort of make customs parity sort of a principle there. Okay, the data elements, I've been talking about the advanced data. This is basically the elements that we have for mail and for the ACAS. For the mail, the one thing that's not on there is the item number, but that's kind of obvious. I mean, every item would need to have its own unique identifier. The interesting thing about mail, which I think is a good thing for postal operators, is that this is a single filing. That data can be sent prior to loading onto an aircraft, and then that same data can be used by CBP for normal customs purposes. So it's a single filing, which we think is a good advantage. So it's a very equivalent data set. Okay, legal authority, Trade Act of 2002, I recall it well, we were implementing that, and we decided to sort of, with the mail, kind of put it off a bit because the postal operators weren't ready. We were worried about cargo and express. And we had to consult with USPS. So we have done that for many years. And I must say, they have just done an amazing job. U.S. Postal Service is ready for advanced data, inbound, outbound. They've really worked hard with us to get ready. So, and then the PAEA Act, and this states that for competitive products, which were deemed to be EMS and parcels, that are imported or exported by the Postal Service, that we and the rest of the government would apply the customs laws in the same manner. Now, the only problem that I have with that, and the USPS knows this, is that what is considered a competitive or market dominant product can change based on the way it's classified. So what we're looking at is data on all packages, okay, whether it's EMS, a parcel, or it's a small packet, because those terms to us, they're postal terms, and those can be changed. The post could say, well, I'm not doing EMS anymore, I'm doing all letter packets, and then all of a sudden it would be exempt from advanced data. So we're looking at doing this for all packages. Okay, what are we doing now? We're doing pilots. We're getting data from a number of countries, and they're in different phases. In some cases, we're getting data and giving feedback to the country that's sending it, and it's being sent by the postal operator. And then what we're doing with some of the data, we're using in a live environment to test whether we can use it for holds. And it's been pretty good. You know, we're getting there. It's not a lot of data, but we're proving the concept. So we have our targeting system obviously in place. We have a pipeline with the Postal Service that any post can feed into. And we've got the operational procedures that are now coming online so that we can do it. We don't have an implementation timeline yet. I'll tell you why, because our approach is you really have to make sure this works. We don't want to legislate something or amend the Trade Act and then we have some problems. So we want to make sure that everything is correct so that when we do put our rules out, it's clear about who gives us data, when, what purpose, what the penalties are going to be, all those things that make for, in our mind, a rulemaking that makes sense. The EU had a different approach. I think they kind of legislated, and then I think we're still working with them on some of the pilots. And again, advanced data, I think it's going to have a lot of benefits for everybody. We're going to be able to look at the packages and crunch them through our system and not hold things we don't need to. Right now, mail is a very physically it's a labor-intensive process. We have to look at everything almost, whether we look at it and open it, or we screen it with X-ray, or we put dogs on it. So we'll be able to screen the things before they even get on a plane, and then to have a release done before it arrives. Of course, you won't know until it arrives. The customer service, e-commerce was talked about extensively at this conference, and I think every e-commerce event I've been to, the customers say, well, it's got to be fast, it's got to be reliable. So there's certain things that they're looking for. So this is going to help. I mean, if we don't have to do the old way of doing things for customs, let's get it through using data, and it'll level the playing field with everybody else with manifesting. Challenges, these aren't necessarily the challenges that I see, but these are the ones that have been brought to our attention at DHS. UPU treaty holds post to universal service requirements and outlines very specific customs forms. Okay, the UPU treaty is there, and posts do have service obligations. But the documentation, in our mind, we need to think differently about this now. You have a CN22 and a 23. The data we're basing our message on is based on the CN23, which is sort of a complete customs form used for parcels. We'd like to see a customs data set and move away from these documents. The CN22 is not a useful form at all. It relies on data from the other parts of the mail piece. So we'd like to move to a more modern way of looking at this thing and have it be a customs data set. Privacy concerns, the reason those are concerns is because we're using the postal network. We prefer a pipeline that builds on the UPU network, because if you have 190 countries that are sending data, it's much easier to have it come through the existing pipeline. But the privacy comes out not because of what we're going to do with the data, but so that posts don't steal data from each other. If it's coming over a postal network, you want to make sure that the customs data just goes for customs purposes. The third point about barcodes, I think that's being addressed quite well, because there is a standard barcode that can be on small packets. So we think that issue is not so much of an issue anymore. I mean, for Express, they have it, parcels, and they do have a standard for packets now. Lack of funding, well, I guess my view on that, frankly, is that if you're a small country, if you have the CDS system, you can put your data in at the exchange office. It might not be ideal. I mean, we want the data as early in the supply chain as we can get it. But, you know, at the end of the day, if you've got 10 packages going somewhere, someone can key them in prior to dispatch, okay, prior to loading. Data quality, this is, I think, the biggest problem we're having, although it's getting quite better on most packages. But this is going to be the issue, because this is a new way of doing things. You know, it's all of a sudden you're going from a manual process with no accountability to something that's got some data discipline in it. And we're working through some of those in the pilots. And the last bit, in terms of local postal and customs cooperation, you know, we have a great relationship with USPS. It's very strong, and that's helped us to work on this. It's a cultural shift. You know, to go from a manual thing that's been around for 200 years to an automated environment, it's a different way of looking at it. And the system interface, you know, we have our own system, but I've been disturbed by some of the reports I'm getting from WCO that some countries, the posts are ready, but the customs aren't. And I don't think that should be an issue, because they can adapt their systems, their cargo and express systems to handle the mail. The messages are all based on EDIFACT or XML. Okay, the roles, we have a big postal model, but I'm not going to show you that slide because it's kind of complicated. But basically, the posts are going to have to give the item level information. When they have it, send it to us. We'll send back acknowledging that we've got the data. And if you don't hear back from us further, you can keep moving the items. So the idea is that if we need to stop something, we can stop it before it's loaded into a container and put on a plane, so that the post will still have control over it and be able to find it. And they'll have to provide nested information. There are postal messages that link items to receptacles and to dispatches. And they'll have to provide a declaration to the carrier saying it's been screened, it's been sent to CBP, so, and that we've had a chance to review it and not said don't send it. The carriers will have to provide an airway bill with the receptacle numbers on it. That's one thing we're working on. And then we'll have to have the responses handled by the right party. Posts are going to handle data quality issues. They've agreed to do that. And if there's a screening confirmation that we need, we'll get it from the post or the carrier. And then we have to look at if there's a real problem, who do we work with? These are some of the things we're working out. Okay, so what's next? More pilots. I'd love to get some pilots from this region. We don't have any yet. So if any post here would like to work with us, I'd welcome it. It would be a really great test. It would help us shape the final requirements and get you involved. We need to establish the protocols. Like I said before, we're still working on some of those things. We want to standardize things to the extent possible. The messages are standardized, but I'd like to see processes and procedures standardized so that posts sort of know what they can expect all around the world. Get the air carriers into the pilots. That's a logical next step. You know, we're testing data with posts, but we need to test the whole thing. And some of the messages we need to work on. I mean, the carriers are going to be the ones that might take a penalty if they bring things in that aren't properly manifested. So they need to have an assurance in the post that the mail has been pre-advised. And then we'll go ahead with our amendments to our laws when we're all ready. And I think I timed it just right. I'm down to 0. Thanks.